My name is Schierbeck. I'm from Copenhagen, Denmark. It's wonderful to be down here in South Africa where you have actual sunlight. So I work for a company called Zendesk, which makes customer support software. I guess some of you know it, but it's an awesome company that paid for my trip down here. I've been doing Ruby for about 10 years and Rails for 4 or 5, so I'm sort of a veteran. Not completely fed up with it yet, but here it goes. So my talk today is called Curly Refactoring the View Layer. I thought it was a pretty kick-ass tagline. Originally, I wanted to talk about this awesome piece of technology that I extracted from an app and how it works under the covers and what you can do with it. But the more I talked to people, the more I realized that there is also an interesting story behind how the technology came to be. I think that's often the case, but I actually decided to tell a story of how and why we came to build a completely new template language for Rails. This is not something you decide to embark on just on a whim. So there is a natural reason for this. Now, a bit of background. We do customer support software, which means, when you send an email or call a company, we handle that actual technology. But we also have a different part of the app that's more end-user focused. So if you have some customers, you probably want a knowledge base and a place where your customers can go in and ask questions and get answers. And we call that the help center. And we've had that for a long time, but we ran into some limitations on the way the product works. So one of the main things that our customers want is to brand the Zendesk experience. They basically want everything to look like their own brand. They don't want their customers and users to come onto the site and have it look like some generic off-the-shelf product. They want to make it their own. And our old product had only very rudimentary support for that. So you could upload your logo, you can change background color. That was not really enough. We then allowed people to upload their own style sheets to make more radical changes, which people did, but still not enough. So we allowed people to run custom JavaScript, and now they could do everything. And that was really awesome for a while. People used it a lot to make radical changes, move stuff around, add in new stuff and widgets and text, everything. The problem was that every time we made a change to some of the HTML, we would inevitably break the layout for one of our 40,000 customers. So it's impossible for us to make changes and improvements to the site after we did this. Now, there were several other problems with the old product, and we really felt that we needed to rethink it entirely. So that's what we did some 2 years ago. I started out on a major refactor, a major rewrite of this application. And one of the main features that we wanted was a radically better way for our customers to customize their sites. We wanted to be like a white label thing that they could build on top of a platform. And we talked it through, like, how do we best do this? What was the problem with the old approach? And in the end, we ended up deciding that in order for our customers to be able to truly personalize and customize the sites, they need to be able to actually edit the actual HTML. So we decided they wanted to introduce customizable templates. And we talked about how it would work, and we came up with this idea. We would provide a set of components that were pre-made and consisted of just a chunk of HTML. That could be a sidebar or the content of a knowledge base article. Everything around that, the customer owned. So they could edit it as they saw fit. They can add HTML and JavaScript, everything they want. They can also remove or reorder the components, giving them complete freedom. So we talked about having a drag and drop interface, but in reality, we just wanted them to have access to the HTML. That's what they wanted anyway, and they were perfectly capable of writing HTML. So we looked at what we had. We had already started working on the actual product, and we had it mostly functional. So for instance, the front page consisted of a list of the categories and articles, had a sidebar and all that. And we could always see that what we envisioned the components would be were already there in the form of Rails partials. So we really just had one big ERB template that we imagined would be the place that our customers would hook in. We had one for each page. So initially we said, well, we have ERB. Why not just have a text area and allow our customers to go in and edit the ERB? And we pretty quickly decided against that. Just never allow people to write executable Ruby code that you execute. So customers should write templates, not code. We very quickly realized that. So what should we then use? Well, who here knows Liquid? Oh, yes, a lot of people. So for those who don't know, Liquid is a small language developed by Shopify, I believe, that allows you to write stuff like this. Basically a very simple templating language. Procedural language, it's very powerful. You basically provide a data set, hashes, objects, lists, and then a customer or user provides a template, and you just render those together and you get the final HTML. Now there were still problems with this that meant that we didn't choose it. For one, it's very granular, and it's granular to the extent that you actually access fields on objects. Now we imagined maintaining that for years on. So if we allowed people to read some field on some object in some hash that we returned, we would have to support that for like 5 or 10 years. That's a huge interface to keep supporting. It's also not really what we wanted our users to experience. Like we wanted normal front-end people and HTML and CSS novices to be able to go in and use our product. We didn't want to require them to be able to actually code. Also, if we rolled out changes to like a huge chunk, we would be able to roll it out to everybody. But if everything was this granular, we would not be able to introduce new features because, you can't just return a new feature in the result of a single attribute access. So we decided against that. So then we looked at Mustache. And who here knows Mustache or Handlebars? Yeah, a lot more. So this is actually a JavaScript library that has been ported to Ruby. And it's closer to what we're looking for. So you have very simple variables, and those map to some kind of mapping you provide in your code, an object or a hash. So the customer would just write a template like that. The problem is that you have for loops, you have ifs, so it's still sort of programming. Although they call it logicless programming, there's actually logic in there. Also, it didn't really integrate that well into Rails. Mustache and Handlebars had their own view rendering system, so you could actually render a partial inside the template. You could also do more stuff inside the template, and that put way too much power in the template, not something we were interested in. We wanted to keep logic and control out of the template so that they were safer. So what did we want? Well, we want something that was safe and declarative. It should be simple for the users to use, and they should just declare where stuff should go. It should be so simple. We also want to keep the logic in a separate place that we controlled, and it was important that it was testable, because we were creating this API that our users was expecting would keep on working. They didn't expect it to break. So we needed to be able to test the logic that we kept returning, what we've been returning all the time. Also wanted to integrate with our existing Rails view. So we had a bunch of partials that we were already using. We didn't want to rewrite all of that just to accommodate this feature. Wanted it to be kind of a plug-in thing. So we decided to write curly. And the basic design is that you put HTML in templates, and there's no logic in there. All the logic is in what's called presenter objects. Now, the presenters are sort of like Rails, classic Rails views. They have full access to all the helpers, linked to, they can render other partials, they can do everything. The templates can't really do anything. It can be used alongside ERB. You can render ERB templates. ERB can render curly. It fits nicely into Rails. It's deeply integrated into Rails. This is an example of a template. It looks like Mustache. Everybody seems to agree that double curly notation is the best, so just kept that. Seems to work. Those are just simple variables. You don't need to know how they get there. They just return chunks of HTML. You can move them around. It's very easy for front-end people to work with. Previously, there was a talk about designers and developers. And our designers and front-end people love this because there's no Ruby to clobber everything. It's just HTML. Now we add another directory in the actor called presenters, and in there goes your presenter. So this is an example. You subclass from curly presenter, and you then have a list of arguments that you require. So this is more explicit than normal Rails views that just silently fail if you pass in, if you fail to pass in the right parameters. That happened a lot to us, so we decided to make it explicit, and it'll complain loudly if you forget to pass in some local parameter. Now, the way you pass it in is if you're rendering, a normal view from a controller, you just assign an instance variable. If you render a partial, you would pass it on with the locals, as you would normally do. Now, all the public instance methods on the presenter map back to the template. So the way you define the interface between the presenter and the template is through normal public methods, as you would any other object API, right? Finally, there's a naming convention that maps a template to a presenter. So the presenter is automatically instantiated for you, and the template is rendered against that initialized presenter. So everything just works. If you convert a view from ERB to curly, you then need to change how you actually render that view. If you have a partial, you can still just render that partial name, and everything just works. So this was safe and simple for our customers to use. And we actually put it in the product about a year ago, and they can just edit the templates in their browsers, click save, and their sites are updated. So after we did this, we went back and looked at the templates that we had converted from ERB to curly. And we started to realize that maybe we could use curly for more than just customizations, because it seems that these views that used to be really complex and contain a lot of Ruby code suddenly became a lot more manageable. The front-end people preferred the curly templates to ERB templates, and the back-end developers preferred the presenters to the ERB views because now suddenly all their code was in a normal Ruby class. So just show you a quick example of a transformation from ERB to curly. So this is a fairly typical ERB view. You have some ifs, you have a local variable assignment, you render some stuff. Now this is the actual HTML. So if you're a front-end developer, of course you find that scary. You don't want to move stuff around. There's code, the ordering is important, and what are you going to do? So in curly, the approach you would take is you would take each piece of logic and remove it, and instead you just have a named variable, something that signifies what goes there. And for a front-end person, it's so easy to just move stuff around. If the navigation should be on top, just move it up there. So ordering no longer matters. You'd put all that code into a class, and you'd have normal methods. You can even use private methods instead of local variable assignment if you want to remove duplication or just extract stuff from a long method. So this is separation of structure and logic. And after we started doing this, we realized that there was actually a lot more we could do to clean up our code after converting ERB to curly. Some of the issues became visible. The views were overly complex, but we had a hard time figuring out how to clean up ERB views because codebase can only take you that far, and sometimes rendering a partial can be difficult. It may access a lot of different variables, and passing everything in feels procedural. So one of the problems of the entire Rails view stack is that it's basically procedural code. And you feel the pain of that once you reach a certain complexity. But now we can start dealing with it since we mapped it onto objects. So one thing that's very simple is to just include your helpers directly into the presenter. So normally in Rails, you would include helpers into the controller, which doesn't really make sense because the controller shouldn't care about how the view renders stuff. Or they actually have to include it at the controller level because there's no mechanism for doing it at the view level. Well, since presenter is just a class, you just include the methods. It's just completely normal Ruby. So you can use private methods. It's actually really nice when you can break up a lot of view-related code into small private methods. You can even use inheritance if you want to. It's like an example of subclassing a base presenter, overriding a method, changing what it does. More importantly though, we saw that our approach to testing could change dramatically when we introduced curly. So traditionally view testing, how many people actually test their views? Not that many people. So one of the reasons why is that it sucks. It's difficult to set up. You need to render the entire view, and then you have to parse the result, because when you render a view, you pass in some data, and then you get back this huge string representing the entirety of the view. But you're only interested in what's in like the H4 heading. So you have to parse that out, and then compare that against something you know. That kind of sucks, and introduces this weird cycle where you render the entire template, and then you parse it, and then you hope that you parse it correctly, because otherwise your assertion makes no sense. So instead of doing that, we just test our presenters. So the way it works is that you instantiate a presenter with some data, and then you just call the method directly, and you can make an assertion on that. Looks something like this. You initialize the user presenter, you pass it in a context. That can be an actual action view context with all the Rails stuff, or you can just pass in a test double if you want to maintain full control. And then you pass in a hash of the variable assignments that you want to have. Then you just call a method on it, and you can make a normal assertion. Very easy. So we figured out that we could test logic with unit tests, something we couldn't do before because the view integrated everything automatically when rendered through ERB. And we decided that we didn't even need to test the structure because we just look at the curly template and you can see the structure. And that's how we started cleaning up our views. Now all existing view specs still pass because it integrates into Rails, so you can actually still test the entire view if you want to. But apparently not that many people do. So finally, there's also caching. So we have a knowledge base with a lot of content, and sometimes we show hundreds of thousands of things on, say, the front page of a help center. That can be very costly. So what we do is we cache a lot. We cache on multiple levels, and there's an entire talk about like Russian doll saw caching and all that. But we figured that we should have an easier way to cache stuff in curly. That's what we decided to do. So you can just define the cache key method in curly, and curly knows that it's a special method, and before rendering a view, it'll call it. And if you return something that's not null, it'll look in the cache based on that cache key. If it's not there, it'll render the view, store it in the cache. So this is extremely simple caching. Now, I'm not sure how many people here have heard about cache digests. Not that many. So normally in Rails, you would traditionally just bust your entire cache every time you did a deploy, because you may have changed like a small partial somewhere, and you want that to be present even though you have caches, right? So cache digest is a way to signal that no, this thing has changed, and Rails knows to invalidate the correct caches so you don't have to destroy all caches. And curly integrates deeply into that. That's one of the README. But it's a very good way, if you have a cache heavy side, it's a very good way to avoid just busting your entire cache and losing performance whenever you deploy. There's also kind of a cool thing you can do, something we do. We support both mobile and desktop, and we want to keep the mobile HTML very light so it loads faster. what we do is we actually have two curly templates that map to the same presenter. And in the mobile template, we just don't include everything. We just move some of the components out and we simplify the HTML. And curly can just figure out how to combine it correctly. It's a little heavy in Rails, but it works pretty well. Now, whenever I do this, talk about curly, people ask me how I actually implement it, how it fits into Rails. So in order to show you that, I did like a small diagram. So usually you only know about action controller when you talk about rendering views, right? So you have an action, you assign some instance variables, and then that's it. Magically, the right view gets selected and rendered, or you render a partial and magically Rails renders everything for you. So what actually happens is that action controller determines the name of the template that should be rendered, and that's the virtual path, something like post/show. It passes that on to ActionView, and ActionView goes out and finds that template, usually on a file system, then turns it into a template object and figures out which template handler should compile that template. Usually it's ERB, but if you have a .curly suffix, then it'll say, oh, it's curly. So it'll pass the template object to the template handler, asking it to compile it. And it's actually compiled into a string containing Ruby code. So that's actually what happened. Return Ruby code in a string. ActionView takes that code and uses it to define a new method on an internal module it maintains. And it can get back to that method name later on. Then calls a method, and the resultant HTML is passed on back to Action Controller. The third thing about this is the next time Action Controller asks ActionView to render a template, it already got the method. So you can just call a method, everything is rendered. So that's pretty clever. So this is the prototype version of curly, and it's not entirely safe, and it's a bad idea to do like this, but you can actually get this running. This is the way you can convert a curly template into Ruby code. You would deduce the presenter class name somehow. Then you replace all the instances of the double bracket notation with Ruby string interpolation syntax, calling a presenter variable that's not yet there. Then you return a string where first initialize presenter, passing in self, which will be the ActionView context at the time of the rendering, as well as the assigns, which is contained in the assigned variable. Then you just return that string containing the string interpolation. This may be a bit difficult to follow, but just an example of how simple it is to actually do this. There's a lot more examples in crafting Rails applications by Mustache that I was reading while doing this. It's really helpful if you're messing around with the internals of ActionView. So, would it say that curly is better than ERB? Well, it kind of depends. I still think that ERB is really awesome for simple stuff. But the problem is, once you get to really complex views, and the procedural methods that Rails give you to handle complexity in views are no longer enough to keep complexity at bay, you need to resort to other stuff. Now, there is a bunch of things you can do, but I think that curly is the best I've found so far for dealing with massively complex things. So basically, we use a mix of both ERB and curly. Actually, when we started out and we're just introducing curly, we tried to just use it everywhere. But that quickly turned into a mess because the simplest partials did not benefit from being curlified. Instead, you just had two files instead of one, and everything is just confusing. So we kind of rolled that back and found a good balance. And that's really something that I learned, basically. I think in conclusion that one of the things I learned was that if you impose some restrictions, you can come up with a more creative solution. So if we did not have the restrictions that it needs to be safe and it needs to be really simple for customers to use, we probably wouldn't have come up with curly. We would have come up with something where there was more powerful templates. But having more powerful templates also meant that we couldn't make assumptions about the state of the template. So because we know that templates are non-procedural, they're completely declarative, we can actually make caching smarter. We can make stuff faster. So that enabled us to make something that was more sophisticated because we had a known foundation that we can work on. Secondly, I also learned that it's okay to solve part of the problem. I think we have a tendency to try to solve all problems, like find the general solution as engineers. And that's something that has been haunting me for years. And more recently, they realized that oftentimes you just try to solve a very specific problem you're facing instead of finding the general solution and inventing an ORM every second week. And thirdly, I want to say that there are a lot more tools that can be used with Rails than those that come out of the box. And I think that it's really great that we started using more diverse tools and we try to make Rails more of our own. It's a trend that's been going on for like a few years, and I think it's really awesome. And I hope that you guys will look at Curly and try it out. It's not for everybody, but I think hopefully it can help people manage very large Rails applications. So it's available as a gem. Some asshole took Curly. Like a wrap around curl, how smart. Yeah, it's available as a gem. Curly-templates. And it's also open source on github.com/Zenith/Curly. And yeah, I'm Daniel Schierbeck, and thank you for staying and not running out. So I don't know if you have any questions. Yep.
So you showed us caching on the presenter level. That's kind of like this. Is there a baked-in caching on the meta level, or do you suggest like presenter section where you have a presenter being pulled on the meta?
So usually I would have a separate partial that I would render. But you can definitely do on a per method basis. The nice thing about only rendering the entire templates at a time is that you get automatic namespacing. You need to worry about actually having proper namespacing when you do per method. But you can definitely do it. Okay. Yeah. Any templating language that hooks into Rails will work with this. So if you use HAML or something else, it'll just work. That's like it integrates deeply into Rails. Anyone else? No, it's okay. Like arguments? You could do that, but then you put like, so I think the question was, could you like put some expressions into the templates? And yes, it would be technically possible, but the nice thing about not doing it is that you know that the template is entirely declarative, and that enables other features. So it's probably better not to do it, but there's been talk about something like that. All right, thank you. Oh, one more question? HAML? Yeah, but I mean, I was looking at HAML for a while, and it's pretty much the same as ERB design-wise. So it has the same limitations. And I spoke with Chad Fowler about this, and he's ridiculing HAML quite a lot. But like he was saying that like if ERB is that you put Ruby inside your HTML, then HAML is that you put HTML inside your Ruby, basically. But design-wise, it's still the same. You still have everything matched together. It's just like what goes on top of what, right? So some people prefer HAML, and I think that's like a stylistic preference. But some people like it.
So the big difference between ERB and Curly is that Curly allows you to limit the power of the user. I mean, you can use presenters with ERB as well.
Yeah. So you can definitely have like use a presenter pattern with ERB, but it's more of a manual thing. So the nice thing about like we use Curly for stuff that the users can't edit. We use it all over. But just because it automates the setup of the presenter and it makes the templates very simple, and it ensures that all the logic is in one object that we can test directly. So that's why it is like presenter pattern. You can also do that without Curly, but Curly makes it so much easier. Yeah, definitely. But you can use a mix of your B, HAML, and curly if you want to. Any last questions? Yes. Thank you.
No come electro por la vida.